You're listening to The Possession Files, The Trials of Anneliese Michel, a Red Treehouse exclusive series. You can listen wherever you stream podcasts. Simply search for the Red Treehouse and be sure to follow, like, and subscribe, and leave a 5-star review. An important note: sources for this episode can be found in the show notes. The Red Treehouse is dedicated to my dad. I love you, Pop. The first time I heard the name Anneliese Michel was back in 2005, after watching The Exorcism of Emily Rose. Initially, I had no idea the movie, which I think even now is one of the best and scariest, was inspired by her harrowing and tragic story. A quick confession: horror movies based on real-life cases fascinate me to this day. I'll watch the movie, then almost hyperfixate on the true story, reading articles, books, and anything else I can get my hands on. What is true now was also true back then. The movie piqued my interest, but the initial fascination turned to dread, which then turned to abject horror at the realization of what happened to Anneliese Michel. For several years, she struggled with various medical and mental health ailments for which she received treatment, but at some point, she became convinced that her afflictions were not medical or mental health related, but rather spiritual. And in fact, she believed she was possessed by at least 6 demons, whose constant assault on her mind and body eventually led to her death at just 24 years old. It's an unfortunate truth that the fullness of our lives, no matter how long or short, is often reduced to snapshots, an accomplishment here, or a disappointment and failure there. It's also true, with some exceptions, that a person should not be measured by these snapshots. We as human beings are far more complex, and while convenient, we should resist the urge as much as possible to reduce one another to the highlights and lowlights of our lives. So often, the story of Anneliese Michel begins at the end of her life and tracks backwards. And the heartbreaking pictures and bone-chilling audio clips of her alleged possession and subsequent exorcisms often take center stage. Yet, this feels wrong, because Anneliese was a young woman with hopes, dreams, and plans for the future, even amidst the agony and suffering she experienced. And as we grapple with what happened to her, it's important to ask, who was Anneliese Michel? The answers will give invaluable insight into every aspect of her story. And rather than fill in the blanks with conjecture, sensationalism, and assumption, we should let Annelise speak for herself. In this first episode of The Possession Files, we're going to paint a portrait of Anneliese Michel, her childhood and adolescence, and hopefully gain a better understanding of who she was, so that we can better grasp what happened to her. I'm your host, Will, and together let's explore The Possession Files, The Trials of Anneliese Michel. Anneliese Michel was born in West Germany on September 21, 1952, to parents Anna and Joseph Michel. The family resided in a comfortable 2-story home in Klingenberg, where her father owned a sawmill. The second oldest child, Anneliese had 4 siblings, an older sister Martha, who tragically passed away at 8 years old after complications during surgery to remove a tumor on her kidney, Maria, who was born in 1954, Barbara, who was born in 1956, and Roswitha, who was born in 1957. Joseph Michel was born in 1917, and Anna in 1920. Both grew up in religious families, with Joseph's mother hoping he would grow up to become a priest, as 3 of her sisters were nuns who taught at a secondary school. Joseph attended school in Miltenberg, and for his part, he did well academically, though he struggled in Latin, which forced him into a different direction away from the priesthood. Joseph's father wanted him to take over the family business, so the career pivot was welcomed, and even more so when Joseph passed his journeyman's examination in carpentry after spending 3 years as an apprentice. These plans were put on hold, though, when in 1939 he was drafted into the German army and sent to fight on both the Eastern and Western fronts. An entry in Annelise's diary, dated October 29, 1975, tells of an experience Joseph had while fighting abroad, and it gives us some insight into her religious convictions. Quote, "Saint Joseph told me that he was the one who saw to it that Papa found those boots in Russia. Papa often told about this, that in Russia his feet nearly froze off. Then suddenly, in the snow, he found a pair of wonderful Russian boots." End quote. As the war came to an end, Joseph was taken prisoner by the Americans. He was released in June 1945 and enrolled in a construction school a year later. In 1948, he passed his master's examination, and 2 years later, in 1950, he took over the family business and married Anna. Anna attended 3 years of secondary school before completing a training program, where afterwards she worked in her father's sawmill as an office manager. Though it is believed she had some initial interest in either becoming a nun or a school teacher, she eventually opted to attend a commercial training program instead. Her family was devout Roman Catholic, and Anna's grandmother educated her and the other children in the family in the Catholic faith and tradition. The religious background of Annelise's parents is important because it will have a major bearing on her life, both as a child and an adult. I mentioned Annelise was the second oldest of her siblings, and that her older sister Martha died tragically when Annelise was only 4 years old. Though her siblings were healthy, Annelise was described as having, quote, little resistance to childhood diseases, end quote, and before she was 5 years old, she had contracted measles, mumps, and scarlet fever. And when it came time for her to enroll in school, the teacher, seeing her small and sickly frame, recommended that she be held back a year so that she might grow stronger. Despite this, when Annelise eventually attended kindergarten, she fell prey to the more aggressive children who pushed her around and picked on her. Annelise's health issues were a tough subject for Anna, who seemed to blame herself for the difficult circumstances. She is reported as saying, quote, "I was still weak when I carried her. You know how it was. We were all so hungry. Even after the war, all that hunger. It is bound to make a woman weak. And the second child after the war, there just wasn't much she could get from me." End quote. Within a short time, though, Annelise began growing stronger, and by the time she took her first communion, she appeared to have been past the worst of it. Religion was a significant influence in Annelise's life, as she and her sisters attended church each Sunday and the occasional weekday with their parents. And while at home, the family often prayed the rosary, and they said their morning prayers to Saint Joseph, the Virgin Mary, and their guardian angels. As a young girl, Annelise enjoyed a variety of hobbies and activities, including singing and playing the piano and accordion. And by all accounts, she was well liked by her peers and teachers. The Exorcism of Anneliese Michel, written by Felicitas Goodman, details how Annelise's classmates felt about her, stating, quote, "She was just like the rest of us. She was a jolly girl, participating in the usual pranks and jokes." End quote. Goodman also recounts a letter sent to her by Annelise's father, Joseph. Quote, "When Annelise and her sisters became bigger, we often took the car and went on outings on Sundays, and the girls sang to their heart's content. They all had a good ear for music, played various instruments, and loved to harmonize when they sang. that was always very lovely, a very happy time. Especially Annelise had a way of just glowing with joy." End quote. Annelise was also a hardworking student, and though there were times when she struggled, her perseverance and resilience always came through. In an interesting turn, Annelise excelled in Latin, a subject her father did poorly in. In a letter to Felicitas Goodman, Anna recalled Annelise's gift, stating, quote, "She would take watch in hand and recite Latin vocabulary assignments with breathtaking speed." End quote. Her mother Anna hoped she might one day become a schoolteacher. Except it may not have been that simple, because the Michels were from a small town, and the teacher's college was in the much larger city of Würzburg. And when discussing this with others, Joseph was often met with this rebuttal, and the expense of sending Annelise to live in the dormitories. Still, Joseph and Anna believed it was advantageous for Annelise to attend, no matter the cost, and it seemed as though this was the trajectory Annelise's life was going to take. Something interesting. While researching, I discovered that becoming a school teacher in Germany, and education in general, is both highly regarded and invested into. This is not to say that it's without problems or difficulties, but rather that school teachers have historically been highly respected. With that in mind, it's easy to understand why Anna was hopeful for Annelise to pursue this particular career path. And, as Annelise approached her 16th birthday, these hopes and dreams were deeply instilled. Except, trouble was looming on the horizon. We'll continue right after this quick ad break. In September 1968, after a long summer, Annelise was excited to get back to school. One day, while she was sitting in class with her friend Maria, she suddenly lost consciousness. Her friend, frightened by the strange occurrence, pressed Annelise's arm and asked if she had fallen asleep. Dazed and groggy, Annelise shrugged it off as nothing more than overexhaustion and spending too much time studying. But later that night, around midnight, Annelise was startled out of sleep, and a heavy pressure on her chest from an unknown force rendered her unable to move. She tried desperately to scream, but her breathing was labored and ragged, and her tongue felt as though it was also paralyzed. Terrified, she urinated on herself as the pressure on her chest and abdomen increased. Then, as suddenly as it began, it ended. Within a few minutes, the pressure was gone, and she was able to move once again. Annelise changed her bedsheets and tried to salvage a decent night's sleep. But the next morning, she woke up exhausted and told her mother of the scary events from earlier that night, and she was kept from attending school that day. Anna's initial worry was abated when the strange episodes didn't continue. Annelise continued attending school and receiving good grades, and it seemed that whatever happened that night was an anomaly. In fact, Annelise completed the school year without another incident, and by the summer of 1969, it was all but forgotten. On the summer of August 24, 1969, nearly a full year after the first incident, Annelise experienced another blackout episode. And that night, like the first time, she was awakened by a strong pressure on her chest and abdomen. Her arms were stiff, she struggled to breathe, and despite her best attempts, she could not cry out for help. Then, like the first time, within a few minutes the pressure eased up, she was released, and things went back to normal. Later that morning, she told her mother about the horrifying experience, and she was promptly whisked away to her doctor's office for a checkup. While there, Dr. Vogt referred Annelise to a neurologist, Dr. Luthi, in Aschaffenburg. Within an hour, Annelise and her mother were on board a train to the neurologist, who ran a series of tests which showed no concerns or abnormalities from a neurological or psychological point of view. He scheduled an electroencephalograph, or EEG, for 2 days later, Yet despite taking this next step, the EEG showed normal brain activity. Still, there had to be some explanation for Annelise's blackout and paralysis spells, and based on the description Dr. Luthi was given, he diagnosed her with, quote, probably a case of cerebral seizures of the nocturnal type, with the symptoms of grand mal epilepsy. Judging from the description, this was probably a case of the convulsive kind, end quote. A quick note. We'll explore the medical diagnoses, treatments, and effects in more detail in episodes 3 and 4. Despite Dr. Luthi's diagnosis of epilepsy, he opted not to prescribe an anticonvulsant, as he felt the seizures were far enough apart to justify close observation. And though she agreed, Annelise's mother worried about whether the seizures would impact Annelise's plans to become a schoolteacher. Annelise's subsequent return to school coincided with her growing increasingly sick. She had a lingering sore throat, which eventually led to her tonsils being removed. She contracted pleurisy, which according to the Mayo Clinic is defined as, quote, a condition in which the pleura, two large, thin layers of tissue that separates your lungs from your chest wall, becomes inflamed. Pleurisy causes sharp chest pain that worsens during breathing, and these tissues swell and become inflamed. As a result, the two layers of the pleural lining rub against each other like two pieces of sandpaper, end quote. Annelise also struggled with a bout of pneumonia, which was further complicated by a tuberculosis infection. Now on bed rest, Annelise was forced to withdraw from school, and with no improvement in her condition, she was eventually admitted to a hospital in Aschaffenburg. On February 28, 1970, she was transferred to a clinic in Middelburg which specialized in lung disease in young adults. While there, she was diagnosed with heart and circulatory problems. At Middelburg, Annelise relied heavily on her faith and devoted significant time to prayer and contemplation. And it was here, while recovering from her ailments, that she began considering the course of her life. In a letter to her mother, Annelise expressed, quote, I will try to obtain the Abitur, exams to gain entrance to university, even though before you came, I had come to the resolution not to pursue the Abitur, but to become a catechist. I can always do that if I don't succeed in obtaining the Abitur. Perhaps I can better use my abilities and talents if I become a teacher. There are no accidents in life. It is all in the providence of God. So I have arranged with the Mother of God that I will become a catechist if I don't obtain the Abitur. But in the case that I obtain it, I will become a school teacher. End quote. And in another letter, she stated, quote, actually, I am quite glad I have been sick, since one comes to see things. One comes to recognize that there are other values besides money, riches, and cars, which are worth living for. That one is on this earth for the glory of God, and not for transitory things. You should consider this also sometimes. When one is healthy and is immersed in his daily routine, he thinks, all is well with me. Why should I be concerned if others in Biafra or Latin America are starving to death? The important thing is that all is going well with me. What is worse at the present time is the indifference towards our neighbors. People today can be so inhuman because all is going well for them. Really, the horrors of the last war ought to remain imprinted on them. But today, that is all forgotten. You can mark one thing for sure. I want to go to heaven, cost what it may. To gain heaven, nothing is too much for me. On that account, I should place my life at the disposal of others out of love for God, and hope more for the reward of God than for the reward of men. Better to be despised by men than God. Perhaps you know now why I would like to become a catechist, if God has ordained that for me. And be glad I think that way, and that you don't have a street girl for a daughter. End quote. During her stay in Middelburg, Annelise roomed with a woman, Monica Fichtel, who described her as, quote, a happy person with a positive outlook on life. She was religious and didn't talk about her health concerns. End quote. Annelise often encouraged Monica to pray and mentioned the shrine to the Virgin Mary in San Damiano, Italy, a place where the apparition of the Blessed Mother was alleged to have appeared. Something important. This is not to say that Annelise's struggles were easy on her, and it was reported that she struggled with homesickness, loneliness, and at times felt like an outsider. She longed to be discharged and return home, and as grateful as she was to receive letters, they, quote, made the loneliness even more cruel, like a pain in her chest, a dark pain with ragged, red edges, end quote. And as resolute as she was to, quote, suffer as Christ had taught people by his example, end quote, she also prayed fervently to the Virgin Mary, hoping that each morning when the nurses checked on her, they would tell her she'd be going home. But it didn't happen, at least not quickly. On June 3, 1970, Annelise suffered another seizure. Her arms went stiff, she had difficulty breathing, and she urinated on herself. She struggled and fought against the scary force holding her down. And finally, she screamed, alerting staff and startling the other patients. And, like previous episodes, the pressure released within a few minutes, and she was back to feeling normal. The next morning, the girls in her unit left her alone, possibly sensing that she was physically and mentally exhausted. But soon enough, the questions came. What's wrong with you? Can't you see it's all in your head? Did you fall and hit your head or something? Overwhelmed, Annelise retreated to her room where she continued praying and pondering. A few days later, around dusk, Annelise was sitting in her room, waiting for the lights to come on. As it grew dark, Annelise began praying the rosary and reminiscing about home, where her family often prayed the rosary together before dinner. Holding the rosary in her hands, Annelise continued praying fervently, and within a short time, she began to feel a powerful sensation course through her. She felt a soft tingling in her cheeks and a trembling in her lips. Something was different, and she felt, quote, a sweetness she had never known before, end quote. Looking out the window, she noticed the mountains were more beautiful than she'd ever seen them before. Suddenly, she was startled out of the trance by the sound of the girls behind her. She wasn't sure how long they'd been there, and by the time she turned around, they were gathered by the door, and the lights to the room had been turned on. Felicitas Goodman details the interaction. What were you doing anyway? Their voices were awfully loud, even louder than usual. Praying, of course. We can see that, but what's with your hands? My hands. Yeah, your hands. We were watching you. Like you had a cramp or something. Like when my cat scratches her claws. Like you had paws or something. Annelise immediately looked down at her hands, where she was still holding the rosary. She noticed it was strangely beautiful, but her hands seemed no different. Annelise tried to play it off with the girls, telling them they were seeing things and there was nothing wrong with her hands. But another girl spoke up. And your eyes, another girl persisted. I thought they were all blue. Now, they are all black. Annelise again tried to brush this off as a trick of their imagination. But when she walked to the mirror, she noticed her eyes were much darker than usual, and her face was rosy. She lamented that the doctor would not be able to see her, because if he had, she'd have been discharged on the spot. Annelise's sweet feeling carried into the next day, and she reasoned that the Blessed Virgin Mary must be tending to her. She wanted to tell someone, but feared their reaction and decided to wait until she got back to school to speak with Maria. On June 16th, Annelise was taken to see Dr. Wolfgang von Haller, a neurologist who, despite a relatively normal EEG, prescribed her anticonvulsant medication. She remained at Middelburg for another 6 weeks after meeting with Dr. von Haller. On August 11th, he performed a follow-up EEG, and like before, found nothing unusual. And, On August 29, 1970, Annelise was finally discharged from Middelburg. Upon returning home, Annelise's sisters noticed a shift in her mood, which she blamed on exhaustion. Her father Joseph shooed away the girls and encouraged Annelise to rest, telling her they wanted to attend church early the next morning. But something felt off. While at Middelburg, she'd prayed for release and longed to be home, with her family, at her desk in her bedroom, laughing and carrying on. But now that she was home, the feelings of joy eluded her. Annelise was troubled by this, and with good reason. In the days following her experience at Middelburg, where she felt the sweetness and the girls mentioned her hands and eyes, Annelise tried to pray the feeling back. She longed for the feelings of euphoria, and she wanted to experience it again. And while she felt like she came close, it didn't quite happen the same as before. And on one occasion, she experienced something far different, something much darker. Quote, "But one evening, about a week after the trip to Kempten, she felt sure she was going to succeed. It was one of those still days, no wind coming through the window, the foot of the mountains shimmering in the heat. She said with her rosary entwined around her hands, 'I would want to touch the seam of your mantle.' Suddenly, like sheet lightning on the distant horizon, she saw a huge, cruelly grimacing face. It was gone almost as soon as she had seen it, but it left her with a chill of nameless fear. Now, after seeing that face, she felt she could not pray. She put the rosary away into her nightstand drawer. For who knew if instead of the sweet perfume of the presence of the Mother of God, that ghastly grimacing horror would not intrude, dreaded, uninvited. It had already done so a few times, and when it did, it made her swirl, as if she were being hurled into a dark pit. The last time it had happened, a terrifying thought had hit her afterwards. What if this monstrous shape were really in her, not outside, where she seemed to see it? It's in me, in me, in me. The fear of it kept echoing through her mind." End quote. As someone who has worked in the mental health and substance abuse profession for over 15 years, I always avoid making assumptions or judgments. On the one hand, it seems as though Annelise's afflictions are medical and mental health related. Her periodic blackouts, possible sleep paralysis, and diagnosis of epilepsy point us in that direction. But we're still left with an unsettling set of questions. How do we understand and explain Annelise's spiritual experiences? She expressed feelings of euphoria, seeing things as pristine and beautiful, and sensing this sweetness all around her. And what about the grimacing face she saw on the horizon? Were they hallucinations caused by a medical or mental health condition? Or were they, as she suspected, indicative of something darker and far more malevolent? Join me next week as we explore the symptoms and signs that troubled Anneliese Michel. I'm your host, Will. I'll see you next time as we continue our exploration of the Possession Files, the trials of Anneliese Michel.